With that out of the way, join me in welcoming to the stage your next speaker. He has a master's of marketing from Northwestern. He's been involved in the agency, production, and marketing side of what you guys do. He's been in the industry literally since elementary school. He is General Manager, Worldwide Events and Production Studios, Central Marketing Group at Microsoft. Try to stick all that on a business card. He has. Please put your hands together for Scott Schenker, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to listen to some thoughts that I have to share today. It is quite uncommon to follow a do-gooder, a futurist, a stand-up comedian, and an announcement about next year's event. And I'm between you and lunch, so my agent will be getting a call when this is over. We definitely need to talk about where I fit in things. I wanted to talk today a little bit about being a fool. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, a lot of what you've heard today is going to be somewhat repetitive. New ideas, new technologies, spray paint, court gestures. You're going to hear some repeating of that. You're also going to hear some great words from some great people. But I think it's good that you're hearing some repetition in the presentation. So often you come to shows like this and you find out a very diverse and different set of points of view. I think today you're going to hear some repetition. Some of you heard me talk about the role of the janitor in experience and event marketing. It's not the role that you think of when you hear the word janitor, but the role of the event caretaker, someone who takes care of the event as the janitors did for the domains of the god Janus or Janus. Some of you have been to or have seen the website Janus Dialogues, where I sort of take the crazy ideas in my head and put them on paper. Today I'd like to talk to you about the role of the fool. The role of the fool in events and experience marketing. Again, it's not the role you may think of when I say the fool. It's not the court gesture as you heard earlier, but the necessary fool who drives the change and the innovation. Many of my comments are going to be general in nature, and yet events are unique. So I will talk from my perspective, my history, but your world is made up of different audiences, different contexts, different objectives. Some of you are in the business of events, as I was when I was in the agency side. Some of you use events to drive business for your companies, as I do now on the enterprise side. I encourage you to bring your own context to the discussion. I'm also going to be sharing a series of comments. I sort of call it a Twitter stream from before Twitter. These are ideas that have come from some great folks over the years around innovation. Around 1512, Machiavelli wrote his masterpiece, The Prince. It was focused on the challenges faced by a new prince and the differences in how a new prince rules versus a hereditary or an inherited prince. In it, he says about change, it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new way of being. You've heard a lot of folks today, again, talking about new technologies and new ideas. This is a quote that has stuck with me for many, many years. Around 500 BC, Hercules wrote, "Everything changes and nothing remains still. You cannot step twice into the same stream." These two perspectives on change paint a very accurate picture of the challenges faced daily by experienced marketers and event producers. Change is difficult, and yet it is constant. We see it all the time in the simplest of things. The final version of a deck, mine was done last night, changed this morning. It changes because of the presentations you've just had a few moments ago. An idea, a business plan, all released after weeks and weeks of work, only to be revised the next day. It's not the result of the plan being incomplete or the developers incompetent, but the constant state of change that we live in. For annual events and repeating experiences, the constant state of change is both a challenging force on both maintaining legacy and determining when to introduce new concepts and new ideas. For instance, bright, shiny objects come and go. You've seen some of these. They either incorporate themselves into the norms of the event or they burn out and fade away. Sustainability, for example, has become a normal part and an included part of just about every program that we do. Audience response systems, once a technology that was sold to me is going to change the world, not so much so. Audience feedback, a little different than audience response. Surviving or not rarely is an emerging trend so unique that over time it continues to require the same separation and specialization that it enjoyed in its early days. Currently, virtual events and social media are such items. We just heard from Paul and others about the role. They are connecting to, but not fully integrated with the in-person events. And they typically are living for the moment of the event rather than always on in support of an audience or core objective. Often our target audiences, our audiences all of the time, while they are attendees for only a short period of time. They visit our company websites regularly, so why do we always have separate websites for our events? They come to our primary social media channels, so why additional channels to monitor just for the events? And the degree to which measurement is impacted or affected by change is in direct correlation to the amount of time that has passed. This is one reason comparing results of a program to the prior year is far less accurate than comparing them to a pre-event baseline. It is hard at best to isolate the impact and influence of change on an audience over a year-long basis. It's much easier to understand the impact over the few days of the experience. And with that, you may even find that half of your audience, about 120 of the folks here, are first-timers. So comparing results of the event year over year, when over half of your audience is first-timers, is a much, much harder way to say this event, this experience had this impact, than it is to say pre-event to post-event, we had this kind of impact. We heard from a futurist, this is a quote that I've always loved. Isaac Asimov said, "It is change, continuing change, inevitable change, that is the dominant factor in society today. No sensible decisions can be made any longer without taking into account not the world as it is, but the world as it will be." Isaac Asimov was an author and a professor of biochemistry at Boston University, but he's best known for his science fiction books and his science writings. In fact, he was one of the more prolific writers of all times, with over 500 books and roughly 90,000 letters and postcards. An interesting fact, his books have been published in 9 of the 10 major Dewey Decimal System categories that exist. So he goes on to finish by saying, this in turn means that our statesmen, our business people, our event organizers, our event caretakers must take on a science fictional way of thinking at all times. So this means that all planning, So this means that the weight of planning has to be on the future foot, much more firmly than on the back foot. History and legacy, while important and at the same time is very comfortable, can be the barriers and boundaries that at best prevent a full response to the current realities and at worst anchor the experience in the past. This is a delicate balance, and finesse is required to introduce new ideas while maintaining and learning from history. Placing priorities on clear objectives rather than lessons learned, on experience design rather than improving tactics, and on the audience's needs rather than on the host's needs will all point in the right direction. This is the job of the experienced janitor or the event caretaker. By placing the objectives, the experience, and the audience first, the question moves from what to do to how to get it done. Answer the question, what relevant problem am I solving for? This is where the magic occurs, and this is where, as we heard earlier, obstacles become opportunities. Daniel Burnham was an architect and an urban designer. He was also the director of works for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which was known as the World Chicago Fair. He took a leading role in creating the master plans of such cities as Washington, D.C. and Chicago. He also built a few famous buildings, including Flatiron and the Union Station in Washington, D.C. He said, "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir the blood of men and probably will not themselves be realized." He took on one of the largest plans you could imagine. In May of 1893, about 22 years after Chicago had pretty much burned to the ground, he opened the Chicago World's Fair. It ran for 6 months, exactly 120 years ago today. It was anything but small. Among its accomplishments, 25 million visitors at a time when the entire population of the United States was 100 million. He envisioned a city of all-white buildings lit with something that was pretty uncommon at the time, outdoor lighting. To complete in time what was to be known as the White City, he needed to remove an obstacle that painting the roughly 100 buildings represented. The traditional method of bucket and brush wasn't going to get it done in time. So rather than changing the experience or the design, he challenged his crew to come up with something new. And they did. Spray paint, which you've heard a little bit about today and saw one using as their marketing tool. This new technology directly allowed the vision to be created and change the world at the same time. 82 years later, survival drove another world-changing innovation. The rock band Kiss, whose live performances drew thousands of avid fans, but they were unable to replicate that magic in the studio. And yet albums were needed to expand their fan base. They just weren't as exciting in the studio as they were on stage. So in May of 1975, 12,000 fans joined them in Cobalt Hall in Detroit for a live concert. The performance was recorded, and the album was called Alive. At the time, the idea of live recording performances was considered illegitimate. It was only done to fulfill recording contracts with album companies. And yet, Alive went on to sell 9 million copies, making it Kiss's #1 album of all times and allowing them to expand their fan base. And they obviously made a few others, in fact, 10 live recordings of the almost 30 plus that they've done. To many, the album captured the album brought the ability to capture the live music experience from the performance, as well as the music and the words. And this is what made it magical. Abraham Lincoln, longtime Kiss fan, said the best way to predict the future is to create it. This was sort of retweeted a few years later by Alan Kay, who was a leading computer scientist who spent 10 years, among other places, at Xerox PARC, which is where Steve Jobs got much of his innovation. And he said the best way to predict the future is to invent it. Even when the solutions appear as obvious as spray painting did for Daniel Burnham, or as the live album did for Kiss, it can still be hard to introduce, much less get accepted, something new. New technologies are a bit easier. They tend to bring their own magic with them, as we've seen from the kind of projection we're using, et cetera. The first moving pictures were shown at the Chicago World's Fair and show was the world's first Ferris wheel. They were bright, shiny objects of their day, very quickly drawing attention and interest. But it's important to remember that in both cases, there was an objective, an experience, or an audience at the core of that innovation. The first moving pictures were taken by Edward Maybridge in 1872. They were actually designed to resolve a popular debate of the time. Leland Stanford, who was the governor of California, a railroad tycoon, and the founder of Stanford University, wanted to determine whether all 4 feet of the horse left the ground when it was in gallop. He actually had a bet with some of his friends. So Maybridge created a technology that could record the horse running and prove that, yes, indeed, all 4 feet came off the ground, top 2 center images, when the horse was trotting. George Ferris built the original Ferris wheel. It was in response to the experience that had taken place at the 1887 Paris exhibition with this new thing called the Eiffel Tower. The Eiffel Tower, at the time, the largest iron steel building or structure, Ferris wheel beat it. And Ferris wheels continue to this day. It was one of the largest attractions, and I actually noticed coming into town, they're building one here in Vegas as well. New ideas, however, are much harder than new technologies. Machiavelli goes on to say, from his beginnings, it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult. He goes on to say, because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders and those who may do well under the new. The vested interest of those who have done well under the old conditions will run very deep and very strong. They can appear overwhelming and impossible, but they will take some familiar forms. The first is the law of science. It can't be done. Great resistance. It may appear that this is related more to the technology than the idea, but really it's an attempt to reject an idea using an often unfounded scientific argument. You can't go to the moon. You can't make an all-electric vehicle. You can't fill in the blank. Yet when coming from the mouths of authority, it can be incredibly difficult to challenge. Thomas Huxley, who was known as Darwin's bulldog, he was one of the greatest advocates for Darwin's theory of evolution, and he was the person who coined the term agnostic, said that every great advance in natural knowledge has involved the absolute rejection of authority. Ask Darwin, ask Da Vinci, ask Galileo, ask Kiss, and others who've brought new ideas to bear. Even Machiavelli's book, The Prince, was banned by the Catholic Church and placed among a list of prohibited books. Can't think of a better way to sell a book than get it banned. Get it banned by the church, even better. The second way those who have done well under the old systems will resist is the law of legacy. It hasn't been done before. You guys hear this one all the time. And as we just heard from Paul, it hasn't been done before, but prove it to me that it'll work. It's often the most dangerous law, as legacy is the greatest weight on innovation. As deciding not to decide is a decision, given that the world is constantly changing, legacy equates to going backwards, even when you're standing still. John Locke said, "New opinions are always suspected, and usually opposed without any reason other than they are not already common." You've heard versions of this a couple of times today. And the final way that those who have done well under the old will resist is through the laws of society. It's not allowed. Now, this may appear as an attempt to stop an idea where the other barriers have typically failed. Now, this may be a law, it may be a policy, it may be a mandate, it may be something that comes down from corporate somewhere or from some outside group or someone who's just not comfortable with the idea and can't disprove it or can't live off of the legacy idea. But it is nonetheless the law of society. Recently, the New York State Automotive Dealers Association pressed New York State legislature to pass a law preventing direct sales of automobiles from manufacturers. All cars would have to be sold through dealerships. At the moment, Tesla is the only company of significance who sells cars directly to consumers. So this became known as the anti-Tesla law. This is really less about Tesla and the idea of electric cars, much more about the idea of direct sales. Now, the bill failed, and Tesla continues to disrupt the industry, not only with electric vehicles, but by selling cars directly to consumers. Resistance will not always come in easy to recognize ways, nor will it always come in this order. Nor is answering each one of these necessary to achieving innovation. Samuel Johnson was an English writer whose Dictionary of the English Language was published in 1755. Until the completion of the Oxford English Dictionary 150 years later, his was viewed as the preeminent British dictionary. He said, "Nothing will ever be attempted if all possible objections must first be overcome." What was true for Daniel Burnham in 1893, for Kiss in 1975, and today for all of us, the best innovations meet a need. Their value comes not from itself, but from the objectives it serves, the experiences it improves or resolves or addresses, and the audience needs that it fulfills. These are not solutions looking for a challenge, not strings being pushed, but they are solutions to a specific challenge, a string being pulled. They are easier to accept because they are not mandated, and they serve to inspire others. A detailed planning review, who's your audience, what's your objective, what's the message, the environment, the medium, the measurement, and an effective marketing and communications plan. Who am I targeting? How am I going to be relevant? How am I going to differentiate, orchestrate, and measure? Should enjoy the respect of being applied to each experience, no matter how often we hear, "We know our audience, we don't have time to do that, this is how we've always done it." What challenges does the experience marketing world face right now? We hear a lot about, we're dealing with budget predictability. Consider things like trigger budgets, where certain aspects are committed to and the rest are triggered only when you see the revenue coming in. Or capacity events, which are much easier to predict and manage to than open events. We see challenges with attracting audiences. Again, capacity events have a draw on their own, and folks will typically register very early for a capacity event. Look at custom pricing packages and online content programs. We hear about trying to prove business value right now. And again, the pre and post-event survey rather than the year-over-year analytics is a great way to focus on whether the objectives and changes were achieved. And we hear about measuring business impact. Implementing on-site actionable diagnostics instead of relying on that post-event survey. There's so much we can do during the event and experience itself to make it better rather than waiting until the program's over to understand how we could make it better next year. Next year's way too late. A vast majority of human beings dislike and even dread all notions with which they are not familiar. Hence, it comes about that at their first appearance, innovators are always been derided as fools and madmen. I'd encourage you to be a fool. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, one more round of applause. Put your hands together for Scott Schenker.